welcome to Bowties, as sometimes called. Myself, Ashley, Ed, and James. Good evening, gents.
Evening, Ash.
And
Evening
James,
all.
nice to see you guys. Nice to see you guys. Got any drinks there this evening?
Oh, you shouldn't do this to me, but yes, I do. I'm afraid it's a naughty one as well, so
Oh, and Ed,
apologies.
I think Ed might as well, but he's just pretending he hasn't because he's got a mug, a cat
It's
mug.
an
Oh,
empty.
it's empty. Oh,
It's empty. Just finished my tea now.
oh, well, there we are. Good boy, Edward. And I'm on Coke as usual. Coca-Cola, that is. Right. So we have been so lucky recently. We've had some absolutely wonderful guests, and tonight is no exception. James, I know that you've said to us that this was the man that you wanted to get on the chat,
Mm.
and this name has been brewing for a while, and the stars have aligned, and here we are. So, and with that, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce our guest this evening.
Oh, well, it's a real honour. I can't thank him enough for his time today. Our guest tonight is the wonderful Mark Bowsher. You will probably know him well. You could know him from many things. Most famously at the moment from his splendid um, celebrity diary parodies that do the rounds on Twitter. Most notably, Mr. Timmy Mallet quite recently. Um, Aside from that, though, Mark is an award-winning filmmaker, writer, a bit of acting as well. He's been the founder and director of Rabbit Island Productions, with a plethora of chart-topping documentaries under his belt, including such notable titles as The First Britons for History Hit. In 2018, Mark's first novel was released. 2018, The Boy Who Stole Time, which introduced readers to the mythology, the essence of time itself. And Mark recently crowdfunded to release the next two installments of that series. Mark, thank you so much for sparing us the time.
No, thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
It certainly is. And yeah, we are very grateful because we know you're a very busy chap. And you have, as you mentioned just before, you have an awful lot of projects coming to conclusion right now. So it is appreciated. Thank you very much. Mark, I've got to start off with something I ask quite a lot of multi-talented people whose creative energies
Sure.
grow and evolve in different areas. Where does your first creative passion lie? Are you a writer who produces, or are you content to just go where the journey takes
I think my really pretentious answer to that is I like to be a storyteller, but nobody can call themselves a storyteller because you just sound silly. I think it's always writing. I would go absolutely mad if I was just at home writing on my own all the time. Um, but I think that's why I do directing. And for me, it's always a difficult kind of balance because particularly when you're writing a script, you sometimes get people saying stuff you put in there is a bit too directorial. I was like, yes, but I know how that performer, how I want to work with them, and it's a good sort of thing because also you don't want to put everything in the script. Apart from the fact it takes up lots of time, you need to work with the actors and give them a bit of freedom, even if you've got, a sort of set idea of how it should look. If you're a bit too Kubrick about it, in my personal opinion, it gets a bit restrictive. So I think everything starts with writing. But if I didn't do directing when I'm not spent a while with working with actors, you know, then I go a little bit crazy. That's where I started, was doing theatre and stuff at school, and that's the first thing I was like, okay, this is the first thing I've ever done that actually works for me. So that combination of writing and directing is kind of where I see it.
Well, that really makes sense. I don't think it's pretentious at all to say you're a storyteller. That's what we all want to be, really, isn't it? We should just
Mm.
say it proudly. But I also find it fascinating that the breadth of your skill set is very much mirrored, for me anyway, in the breadth of the genres and topics that you work in. We think we first met each other, stumbled across each other on Twitter. I am not calling it X for anybody, because I think we had a number of mutual chums and shared interest in love of things like Doctor Who, James Bond, stuff like that. But your novel that we'll get on, your first novel that we'll get into in a little bit, it's a fantasy adventure novel. But you've also got a significant expertise in more grounded realism with the factual historical documentary making you've been doing. Do you find the experience in that more real world complements your fantastical creative writing, or is it an escape from reality when you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be both because I think the best escape from reality is to find another aspect of reality, if that makes sense. Like if I went to see June, and I think lots of people were like, "Wow, I want to go away and read the books now." And my reaction was like, "Wow, I wonder where that was filmed, and if I can go there." And then realizing it's Wadi Rum, which is used in lots of Arabia and all sorts of things. And I think the boy who stole time is largely inspired by travels. Each book, I am an absolute love of travel, particularly doing as much of it over ground. When I was 24 to 25, I went traveling for 10 months, and so much of the books are based on travel. Rabbit Island is named after an island in Cambodia that I went to on my travels. So the real world always informs it. I like to fill the books full of things that you think is completely fantastical. Like there's a palace in The Boy Who Stole Time that is made out of living, breathing people. People love that. It's really, it, a really strong image, and that was based off black ants make these great towers. I saw it on a old Attenborough documentary, and there were lots of things within it. There's a bit where they're struggling to find water in the desert. So they find this root and ground it and squeeze the liquid from that. Again, that was from an Attenborough documentary. Um, and there's even a guy who's mentioned in passing who um, he makes a picture using a magnifying glass in the sun. And I did see somebody do that on the streets in Ait Ben Haddou in Morocco, which another film location used for Gladiator and The Living Daylights and all sorts of things, and Game of Thrones. It's the famous mud brick city. So I think there's always crossover. There's always reality. There's always stuff that I don't see quite as much difference. It is different. Writers are different. I once saw that the Amber Spyglass um, that there's a that there was a note on the back of the book or one edition of the book that says um, cover featuring a photo from the author. So I tweeted Philip Pullman and said, I would love to know where this photo was taken. And he said, I think it was a place called something like Head Smashed in Rockets in Canada, I think. And I was so like, "Ah, maybe he's like me. Maybe he just, a lot of his stuff is influenced by his travels." And I basically asked him that question, like, is your stuff influenced by the real world? And he's like, no, I sit at my desk and I make it up. So I like the idea that people are different. Some
Hmm.
writers, we all use stuff, whether it's emotionally or whether it's through travel from the real world. But yeah, for me, when I sit down and write these things, I'm one of those writers who I'm more dictating what's in my head. I don't really do any planning or anything like that. It's just dictating what's there really.
Hmm.
So yeah, so it's not reality, but it's informed by so much of it that a lot of it flows out.
Yeah, I think I think that's very that comes across very very well to readers. I think it's a personal view, of course, as you said, but I think for fantasy to work properly, there has to be an element of reality within it. It's a bit of a paradox, but it makes sense to me, and I love that kind of approach that you have.
And also that sort of idea of escapism versus reality. I wrote The Boy Who Stole Time because I was incredibly depressed at the time and I needed something to cheer myself up. I needed to escape in the same way that I did in Narnia and stuff, but quite, as a kid. But also I at some point was like, I have to, this book has to face up with real world emotional problems. Even when Chris, the main character, leaves for the land of Alir, leaves the real world that we know. At some point, he's got to face up to very real world kind of stuff, or just have his friendships with people he meets on the way. And I like that. It's quite natural that you can run away and you can escape, but you will have to face those things. And I like that sort of cyclical kind of stuff.
Absolutely. I'm going to we're going to talk a bit more about the books in a few minutes, but just drawing back on that more realistic approach for now, and I know Ed's going to have a lot of questions about the documentary work that you've done. You'd mentioned in a message to me earlier in the week about one you're working on at the moment, which is very personal to you, and I appreciate you might not be able to give too much away, but can you tell us a little bit about your dyspraxia orientated documentary that you're working on?
Sure. Well, it's something that interestingly, like I spent several years making documentaries for History Hit, and I'm happy to talk about a little bit more about that later. And I was very keen, I have a real love and interest in history, but my, interest is wider than that as well. And I kept thinking about dyspraxia. That there was a point without going off on a complete tangent about it, there was a point when there was a certain book that had some rather harmful stuff that it was discussed on Twitter, and the massive backlash, and how some elements of the UK press were rallying behind this book was, I found, very problematic. But there was a sort of comment on sort of an autistic child, and that nobody wanted to be friends with him, and there was a lot of stuff around that made me really feel quite angry, and it did make me think that I want to talk more about dyspraxia. And when I started thinking about, what I wanted to do beyond history documentaries, which I hope I still will do lots of history documentaries as well, but I wanted to do something else. And this just really came back to me, and it's a difficult sort of thing, because I think some of the documentaries, interestingly, that had the biggest that had the biggest impact were presenter-led documentaries, and I prefer documentaries that are interviewee-led. I prefer not to have too much of an agenda. You do have to have some, particularly if you're going to pitch stuff, because you've got to have an angle and stuff, even though they understand, commissioners, that something will change or nuance as it goes along. And I really wanted to have something related to that, and I did manage to sit down with a Channel 4 commissioner and chat through some different ideas. And just as she was leaving, I said, there is something else. I've been thinking about doing a documentary on dyspraxia, but I have this terrible fear that I won't be able to do it the way that I want to do it, because I feel that there is this current trend that you need one person who is already quite famous, that has that particular neurodivergence, to lead that, rather than it just being, all sorts of people from all kinds of backgrounds. It's got to be done through them. And she said to me, yeah, that pretty much would be right. So I spent some time approaching people, and some people don't want to talk about it, and I have to, understand and respect that, even though that's quite frustrating at times. But then I did have a breakthrough with one person. We were going to sit down and have a chat, and then unfortunately they were too committed with other things. So I still carry on sort of straddling this line about whether, there will probably be well-known people interviewed as part of the documentary. But I would love it as much to be balanced. There is I don't want to turn this into a sort of criticizing other documentaries, but there was a Chris Packham documentary on autism, which a lot of was really, really interesting. But I also felt that there was a slight kind of, we need one person who is kind of all right as they are. And that's not the best way to describe it, but there was a tone of that I just was slightly off for me. And if there is a presenter as part of it, I want them to be somebody that opens up conversations rather than making sort of final judgments and decisions. And it's really important for me that even if somebody is presenting, they are themselves there to start conversations rather than give answers and give solutions and things like that. So at the moment, it's kind of at a pause, because I've had to do a lot of corporate work that's been paying the bills at the moment. But I am very keen to get back to the stuff that I am really, really passionate about. And every week I say to my partners, like, I need to look at that pitch deck I had put together, dust it off, rework it a little bit, and then crack on with it.
Mm.
Yeah, but in terms of approaching things like that, just very quickly, um, I want to make sure that it looks at lots of different aspects. I don't want to have this sort of feeling that sometimes I think there was something I saw on Dyspraxia recently, like a very brief article on a particular program on the telly, and I felt it ended with it sort of it's part of a magazine program, cut back to the main presenter, and she was like, "Ah," I was like, "No, no, but there are people with dyspraxia who have it incredibly severely, and you need to address that. But you also need to look about people that are getting on with their lives and are fine, or maybe even hesitant to talk about it at all. And I think all of those different things, seeing people that it's another problem I have with the Chris Packman documentary. It sort of felt like all these people needed some way to express themselves, and some of the people he was speaking to were already doing that. They were stand-up comedians, or they were rappers and things like that. And it should be the complete mix of people who have it quite severely, those that are, dealing with it absolutely fine, and it's not a big part of their lives. And that is complicated to do, but I like that kind of challenge, and that's where having a main presenter, will help to sort of condense that and stuff. And there are lots of things. There's a guy called Tumi Sotra who is known as the Black Dyspraxic on Twitter, and he's we had a long chat, and he is very much somebody where we have a lot of similar feelings, and he can talk about the intersectionality of race and neurodivergence. Somebody I was at school with actually went through the care system, and because of that, they completely missed her diagnosis. And I want to do something that I would love it to be like a two-part documentary or something that can look at childhood and adulthood. But it might have to be a more singular kind of thing if it's my first kind of broadcast um,
Mm.
sort of thing. But I want to make sure that it can cover different aspects. And in all the documentaries I do, I like to be able to cover quite a complex range of stuff. I still don't think I've got to the point where I've made them as accessible as they can be, but I don't want them to be dumbed down in any way. The podcast You're Dead to Me is the thing that does that perfectly. You don't have to have any outside knowledge. It includes comedy. It doesn't speak down to you. It literally features lots of sections on nuance. Yeah, that's the perfect sort of balance for me. It's accessible, but not just treating you like an idiot. So
Mm.
that's a key sort of influence.
I'm really, really fascinated by that, and I sincerely hope, yes, you do get the pitch file off and dust it off. And I think it's going to be a very crucially important work when it's done, and will hopefully help a lot of people to see things in themselves and explore a bit more, and also go some way to counter some of the tendency recently to attack even the notion of neurodivergence, or the comments about ADHD doesn't exist, everybody's on the spectrum in some way, and things like that are getting so much prevalence at the moment. So I think a voice such as
I have
yourselves in that work.
um, quite a key part of that documentary, and something that comes up a lot, is this question of labels, and whether, very often people say we're all on the spectrum and stuff. And I think there are some very interesting kind of discussions around that. And for me, I would love the documentary to end, even if there are summing up comments from the presenter. I would love for there to be a sort of montage of everybody who's been interviewed in the film and their thoughts on the idea of labels. And this is where I like to be able to, I have my ideas, but I also like them to be challenged, and things like that. Somebody I spoke to recently on a corporate shoot, and quite a big company, gave her thoughts, and she was like, we. So for myself, I don't like to talk about my neurodivergence. I just like to let people know that these things I might need. And that was really sort of interesting kind of thinking. It's like I like that and appreciate that, and I think there's a lot of things that make sense and make things equitable by doing that. At the same time, I choose, how much you know include it in yourself. It's, how much you talk about it is up to you. I like to make sure that it's dyspraxia is in the mix. I often mention it quite early on, so it gets more visibility. But I don't decide to make it my main thing. Tumi Sotra, who I mentioned earlier, the Black Dyspraxic, who I massively suggest you follow, as talking about the intersectionality of race and neurodivergence is his main thing. So his at least Twitter persona, and I think a lot of his professional persona, he talks about that. He has made it part of his, name and his sort of stuff. But that, it's still not all aspects of himself is what he talks about like that. So I think how we sort of work with those and what, whether we want consider that a label or stuff, I think it is up to us individually. But I find it dismissive, even if I think that there's some good thinking behind it when people say, "Oh, aren't we all on the spectrum?" Because I think it's a phrase that I don't think is very helpful, even though the core of it, the idea that perhaps neurodivergence, I could see in time that phrase changing as we just sort of realize that yes, everybody is different neurologically, obviously, and will these ideas of these different sort of labels, dyspraxia, ADHD, autism, whatever we speak about, will they change? Will they merge? Will we sort of, understand it in different ways? And I'm prepared for all those things to change, but I also don't think it's helpful not to talk about it, and that's why I continue thinking it's good to talk about dyspraxia. But yes, I don't want you to just can assume that I will need something for it, or that I will want to be treated differently. I mention it often because there are things. Friends of mine recently were trying to persuade me to come along to the dance classes they do, and they're like, "Oh, lots of people are clumsy and stuff." I was like, I don't think you quite understand that I will go there and I will be so frustrated. And even if I get it in time, that's the sort of thing I just know that I will need to do in my own time, and I can do things that are very coordinated. Like I play guitar. Um, there's a famous story that myself and my brother learned to play guitar at the same time. We had 10 lessons, and then we learnt on our own. Year later, my brother shouted at me across the kitchen when my mum was in there. It's like, why is he better at guitar than me? It's like, because I practice more. I was used to practicing more. I was also 4 years older than him, so it's probably not even kind of fair. But yeah, but being the way I am neurologically, I'm now trying to work out the point I got had started on. But I think the point is, I still think it is important that we understand those differences and talk about them. But yes, it is our choice to talk about them and stuff. But just that awareness, just to start with, and that's why I do. I did a job last year. Work was so bad, I got a part-time job, and the only job I could get was driving a minibus. And it was one of the most horrible things that I have ever done, even though all the people there were nice. And I said, after a while, I said, like, it was good to have a challenge. I think it's good to challenge yourself, but I am genuinely struggling with this. And they said, well, is there anything we could change? Are there any allowances we should have made for you? And I went away, thought about it, and I came back and I said, do you know what? No, I'd just like you to know what dyspraxia is when I mention it. And that was it.
I appreciate you sharing that. I mean, a quick personal reflection without me to, I suppose, both down it and also, I suppose, a personal question as well. Well, I find it's a simple thing, but I find it very powerful. On your bio on your Robin Island site, you describe yourself proudly neurodivergent. I was very late diagnosed, really, only last year or so. I'm sure many people in that similar position, you get pumped full of antidepressants and told to go away and rest for 6 weeks and you'll be fine and stuff like that. And so it's a strange feeling when you finally are told what it is. And it isn't about, you mentioned labels, it isn't about wanting to have a label or go around and saying, I am this and you must treat me differently. You kind of go through a cycle of acceptance and reflection, at least I found. And you reflect on things like, well, I might have done this differently. I might have done that differently. I wouldn't have gone for that job, and all of these things that run through your head before you, I suppose, reach that place of acceptance and pride. Not in your league, of course, but I try to explore some of that in writing characters in my own stuff these days. And I know you've mentioned earlier on a lot of yourself inevitably goes into your writing. So I know people reading, you're watching and listening to your stuff will see themselves in that, and will find that helpful. Does it help you as well? Is that a process you're going through or did go through earlier on when you're writing obliquely or overtly around that kind of neurodivergence and that kind of issues that faced into your book? Is it as, I don't want to say cathartic, but is it as useful to you as a tool as it is to the people reading it?
But I think it's useful for seeing the differences between yourself and other people. So the story with the boy who stole time is that it was published in 2000 in 2018, and I didn't talk about Krish being dyspraxic, and I had not made him dyspraxic, and I'd left the publisher I was with, and that and the sequel are going to be published elsewhere using the money that I had raised through the crowdfunder. And the same point that I was talking about being angry with this situation online about this book being very dismissive of neurodivergent people, I decided that if I was going to republish it, that I was going to make Krish dyspraxic, and part of the reason was because of that, but part of the reason was also I'd already made him dyspraxic and I hadn't realized. People would say to me like, he really struggles with his confidence sometimes. He's quite clumsy. He does things that are quite odd. There is a scene quite early on where uh he's kind of stuck. He's gone to this, he's traveled from the real world to this magical realm. And then he's like, oh God, I don't know how to achieve my goals. I don't even know where I'm going to stay. I've not even got any food. He's really, really hungry. And he goes into this um basically like an inn, essentially. And there's a teapot or something that's on a stove. And there's this whole situation where he picks it up and then hasn't realized it's hot. And there's this sort of weird sort of clumsiness to this whole scene. And it's part of it is because of clumsiness, but the other part of it is um, I am often very bad at starting a conversation, which is very strange for somebody who spends a lot of time interviewing people. But if there is a reason, but this is why I can be terrible at, I'm either amazing or awful at networking events. I either go around and I don't talk to anybody, or I break through the wall and then suddenly I'm speaking too much to everybody. Um, and you know, the point I'm trying to make is there's a lot of stuff in there that I hadn't noticed were aspects of myself. And as it goes along, I realized there were different aspects of myself. Like people was like, "Oh, Krish is clearly you," and like in my own head, Balthria, who's his wizard friend who he meets, in the world of Alea, is more who I really am, or it's probably who I think I am. Um, and then in the next book we meet other characters, Amir and Shadow Thief, and they all have different aspects of me. Amir is the more middle class sort of part of me that is you know, almost slightly sadistic. I can't wait for people to meet her. But then Shadow Thief is a non-verbal character, and but she is but not incapable in any way. She is probably the strongest person in that book, and the way she can express herself emotionally without words. I have such love for that character, and I can't wait for people to meet her. And that is, another aspect of myself. And I realize as I do this that there are different neurodivergences. I could see the part of me that possibly has ADHD within Balthria, and then the part of me that could almost be autistic or just has things that cross over with autism that go into Amia. So I can see. I think this is a discussion that came up online the other day. Somebody said, "Oh, this character from Doctor Who is clearly I'm trying to remember how they expressed it. Somebody seemed to think that there were certain characters that each uh, New Who showrunner, um, that each New Who showrunner had picked a character and that embodied themselves. And this was an interesting discussion because, like, oh yeah, I totally think that Moffat is the Doctor, but Chibnall is this character or Graham or something like that. And there was a discussion of several of us writers on Twitter, like, I don't think we embody one person. I think we are generally everybody, even the villain. You know, you make a villain the best by adding some humanity to them, even if they're an alien cyborg or something. You know, it's some expression about who you are, who you could have been, and yeah. So I think all those sort of neurodivergence is just they just naturally come into these stories, whether I want them to or not. And it's interesting that script I've been writing, I made a character ADHD, and that is the point when I started realizing that I probably have ADHD as well. There's another writer, a couple of other writers I've been speaking to on Twitter, including there's a children's author, Rashmi Serdepande, and she has recently found out, I think she must be a similar age to me, that she's has ADHD, and it just, yeah, you don't realize it, but it's interesting how writing can help you diagnose yourself with things.
I agree, and I think I don't know if it's a trope or not, and maybe I shouldn't even think that way, but it's in my own experience. I think we all tend to flock together. We just find each other out, and yeah, you seek out like minds without even knowing you're doing it. So, sorry, chaps, if that's news to you. But no, I do appreciate that, and I agree completely. I think it's when people say which character are you, well, none of them and all of them. None of them are exactly me, but there's a bit of me in all of them. So yeah, it's really interesting and moving to hear your reflections on that. So I do appreciate it, and it goes into another question I was going to ask about your overall motivations for the books and the series. And the first one in particular, some fantastical elements in there. There's a lot of blending of reality and fantasy, as you talked about earlier. Bit of a Faustian element as well. If you've not read it, please do, because there's some interesting aspects in there, but also I think quite profoundly, and you've touched on it a little bit. It's very emotional, and you said you were in a bad place at the time. I'm going to say what was going on in your life. I don't even know that, but what were the inspirations behind wanting to tell this particular story?
I think there were a lot of things. One was that it was coming up to the anniversary of my partner at the time's father had just died, and that a lot of that sort of influenced um, the sort of setup of Krish's mum dying, which is his motivation to try and find, you know, the essence of time itself. But I couldn't translate that on, I was brought up by a single mum, so it had to be a mother character. And I think that there was that element of it, but there was that kind of that wanting to escape. I'd been made redundant from a job, and then I was like, that's it. I've always wanted to be a writer and a filmmaker, and that's what I want to do. And I got myself a part-time job at a supermarket bakery just because it was one of the easiest jobs to get because it started at 4 a.m. And I think that sort of suddenly not working in offices with people, it's very strange, I'm very support, people that struggle to work in offices and work much better at home. Ironically, I'm one of these people who prefers being around lots of people. I even hired an office at a theatre company for a while because I felt better there, but I struggled being at home, and the only place I was going was a windowless room where I was doing, uh, you know, baking products, and it's not all idyllic and stuff like that. It was just essentially putting all these part baked things that from the freezer into an oven. Um, and just in that dull kind of environment where you're doing something really tedious, and I was feeling down about not seeing people and not having work and not having money as well, that I I started writing in my head. Lots of the story came from that, and also because I wanted to escape, and I went back to things. You go straight back to things from your childhood. So Narnia, that sort of idea of going into different worlds and things. But then places I've really been, like I said, Morocco is a big influence on that. So I think it's all those things together. Um, just were the big influence, and you go back to all sorts of things, like a big influence on it as well. I realized that there's a key scene where Chris he's been told that he has to go to this palace in this world where the king of Sendai has the Mathali, the Sands of Time, and he's just like, I just don't know what to do. I don't know how I'm going to do this. So he kind of just blunders in. And then, of course, the king, who does have audiences with people, there's a long line of people, and he mocks him and says, if you bring me back a still flaming feather from a fire hawk, um, pearl from a night ocean, and tie a pretty bow around the world, and all these kind of super ridiculous things. And this is a mishmash of different things from my childhood. I realized there's an almost identical scene in Gulliver's Travels, but I only know it from the Ted Danson 90s TV version, which I watched at the time when I was pretty young, where he goes in there and it's the Fountain of Youth and stuff, and there's a door, and he blunders his way in, and then he's almost dragged away, which happens to Krish, and he's like, no, wait, I have something. Krish offers a story, and in Gulliver's Travels, it's a giant wasp sting. But I realized that was there, but then that mishmashes with loving sort of characters that are screwed over by prophecies, which is my love of theatre and English, and where that met when we did, and the macabre, when that all met at school when we did Macbeth. And he's given so many prophecies that ultimately screw him over, and that's all in there. A Cosgrove Hall animation, the boy, what's it called, The Fool of the World and the Flying Ship, which has all, again, it has these, a king sets these random challenges, which is very much The Boy Who Stole Time. It's based on a Russian folk tale, and the cruel king of Sendai and mine is very much influenced by that stop motion animation I watched as a kid. So all of those things mashed together, right? It takes me years, like, I'm watching something I've not watched since I'm from childhood, and I'm like, oh yeah, I got that idea from that. So it's, yeah, everything and everywhere. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question about where it comes from, but
Oh,
everywhere.
it absolutely does. And I know you can't talk too much about what's going up for the second one. And Ed, I'm going to leave it
Kind
after
of it.
this. Don't worry. But I'm going to be fascinated to know where the world, where your world goes, and how this develops. Do you see this going on for more than these next two?
So the crowdfunder is a re-release of the first book, and then the second book, The Dream Peddler's Parade. I have two more books planned after that. I consider it very much like, it's almost like a trilogy, but The Boy Who Stole Time is like The Hobbit. That's the sort of introduction that's maybe a bit more child friendly. It will get darker, and but if you thought The Boy Who Stole Time was dark, The Dream Peddler's Parade is much darker, and it's a bit more mature. So I have planned out. There's quite a there's quite a specific arc over these four books. So got some way to go next, but yeah, I mean, I can talk about Dream Peddler's Parade if you want a bit, but as you know, I will talk too long, so I don't know if you
You can
want.
give us the abridged version, and then I will be quiet for the rest of it.
Um, to talk briefly about the Dream Peddler's Parade, in each book, Krish goes to a different world to find the Mathali, the Sands of Time. And the idea is all he has to do is touch the Mathali, and him and the Mathali will then travel back to the real world, our world. But this world is completely different. I like the idea that each world is, in the first world is a world full of magic, and it's a tiny desert world. It's implied that it's a planet because they can walk around it in a very short amount of time, a very small little desert planet. But Knock Thrice in the second book is completely different. It is a Victoriana city the size of a universe. They say each street is like it's like a city if all the streets of a city were unfurled in a line so they go on for miles. So streets as big as cities, unfurled, um, neighborhoods the size of countries, boroughs the size of planets, the city the size of the universe. And so this idea of countryside is completely alien. And there are so many things that are different. Instead of them having stars and day and night, they have the gas stars, which are these glass globes billowing smoke, and they will, be hovering over and very ominous. And when the economy gets to a certain point, all the stars are automatically turned out, and the sentinels, the bone white sentinels, like moons, are sent out instead. And in this world, they have a complete sort of reverse sort of idea of God and the devil. It's that the devil made the world out of spite, and people go to cathedrals in a sort of cathartic hating of devil rather than a love of God kind of thing, which makes them crave these sort of mythical ideas of a God that will come and save them and stuff like that. So it's not completely a sacrilegious kind of thing. But one key thing is that nobody dreams. So dreams are sold illegally. They are mixed by dream peddlers, and the idea is there is one night a year when the dream peddlers can ply their trade legally, and that is when Krish arrives. And it turns out quite early on that he finds out that a industrialist called Anders Ryker has the Mathali in a safe, and he realizes that the way to get into that safe is to solve these three puzzles, three puzzles that are hidden within dreams. So the story is a pursuit to try and find these rare dreams, to try and solve them. So there's puzzles within puzzles in this story. And then, yeah, but there is also an implication that maybe Riker hasn't opened the safe himself and hasn't got access to the Mathali yet. And there's a lot of rivalry with him and another character called Strover, but it's a complete distraction. I won't talk about that too much. But essentially, it means that he is then pursued by a rather nasty group of characters. Yeah, so it's very exciting. It's very the first book, although it's shorter, is I don't think quite as pacey as the second book. Although a lot happens, it's quite fast and relentless. Feedback I've had recently is like it would be good to have a few more breathing moments. It's very, very exciting, but we go from a lot of dark, exciting. I do like writing stuff that I could see as being set piece action in film or TV adaptations, and I hope it works as set piece action when you're reading it as well.
I'm sure he will. Mark, on a personal level, thank you very much for your time, and thanks for being so open about your inspirations and your work. And at that point, I will shut up, as I'm sure both our listeners will be glad to hear, and I'll hand over to Ed.
James, that's fantastic. Again, thank you very much, Mark, for joining us this evening. I'm going to talk to you a bit about your history documentary work and some of the short films you've made. So I'm going to go back to the late 80s when I was doing A-level history, and very, very inspirational teacher. I hope he's still with us. Mr. Williams said this line that's stayed with me ever since. The past is a different country. They do things differently there. And really, that sort of ties in with what you were saying about travel and stories and everything. So, do you see your history documentary making as just as another avenue for telling stories?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think some of the most exciting stuff that comes out of that is that, in the same way that I want to escape, I have a real passion for finding stories that, we don't know as much about. I love sort of looking into sort of things like some of the topics I worked on were things like the Haitian Revolution and Mansa Musa, and I wanted to look more into sort of Inca culture and things like that. And some of these we know some things about, and others that I love, whether it is nice or nasty, and history is always a mix of those things. I love the idea of delving into something that is real and something that happened, particularly when there are sort of interesting angles or nuances, because so often people think that it's all very binary and there are good guys and bad guys. There was a documentary I did on Atahualpa, the last Inca emperor, and I wanted to tell it more from his side, whereas usually you would hear it um, told as a story of sort of Pizarro and the conquistadors. Um, but it's not like it comes across as like, oh yeah, Atahualpa is a good guy. I don't think either of them are very nice people, and that's often what history is like. Understanding that you know it's not all sort of good and bad. So yeah, I think it's for me, all that stuff informs kind of um, you know, lots of the sort of other stories and things like that. It's just with history, it's very difficult to how you focus it in, how you simplify it enough, but make sure it's nuanced as complicated as it was in real life. So that balance is the much more difficult thing.
And again, history documentaries. My wife and I are a little bit obsessed with them. But when we sit down to watch a history documentary on BBC Four or Channel 4, it's usually the Tudors, the Victorians, or the Romans. Yours don't really touch on any of those sort of aspects of history. How do you choose the eras that you want to cover? I mean, what made something, for example, like the, Atalupa, something that you wanted to make a documentary about? How do these periods you've covered speak to you?
Um, well, I think part of it is that I've got a terribly short attention span. So at some point there will be something that's been mentioned to me at some point in my life, and I'll be like, I would love to explore that. Atahualpa was that at school. Like I said, one of my only sort of outlets. I struggled with sports and everything like that, but something I loved was theatre. That is what I think is the start of me becoming, a director and everything like that. And we did a production of Peter Shaffer's Royal Hunt of the Sun. Do you know this? I don't know if you know this play at all. It essentially tells the story of uh, Atahualpa and Pizarro, which is just an incredible story. I think it's probably condensed and romanticized and stuff like that. But how the conquistadors turn up, take over, but then Pizarro and Atahualpa have this kind of friendship, and will he have to execute Atahualpa and stuff? But I played Pizarro in that, and my best friend John, who weirdly I'm going to pick up from the station tonight, was Atahualpa. Probably wouldn't be right for him as a white man to be playing a role like that now, but this is school productions, and so that sort of thing left a like I was so fascinated. I would love to explore that kind of topic. So I think there are little bookmarks in my life where there are things that fascinate me, and so often it's things that are, yeah, not things that I like. And a lot of people say everything is just the wars and the Tudors, and I don't think it's that we don't like those periods, because I love those periods. I was fascinated by them in school. I'm still fascinated by them now. I will happily watch documentaries on those. I just want other things, and it was crushing that commissioner I spoke to recently said, like, yeah, people just want, to be honest, people want stuff from their own country, and that was quite crushing to hear, and also think it's not true, because firstly, I mean, there was big discussions about during Black Lives Matter about topics that people weren't covered, and it was quite clear that there are diasporas that were like, why the hell is this not, we'd all watch this. And people from all kinds of backgrounds, if it's a good story, if it's positioned well, they will be interested in it. And there was this discussion that stuff from the UK sort of were most interesting. But then I remember when I was doing stuff for History Hit, Dan Snow sending out a tweet about the Mansa Musa documentary we put out, saying that he was pleasantly surprised that people were watching this in droves. which was not the sort of thing that, typically they thought would be a hit. I mean, I was really lucky with History Hit because they were looking for content. My brother's a history teacher. He said, "Why don't you get in touch with them?" And I did. I got in touch with them, and they were like, "Well, do you have any history documentaries that exist already?" It's like, "No." Would you take commissions? And I sort of sent a list of ideas, and there were all sorts of things, but they went. The first thing they went for was the most current, which was I had a list of 8 different things, and one I said was this was right during the Black Lives Matter sort of protests, and when Bristol, the statue of Edward Colston was thrown in the harbour here. And I started seeing articles on how different places around the world had, uh, you know, what they'd done with their statues. And Germany obviously has this really interesting memorial culture there. And so I pitched a documentary on that, thinking, oh, they won't pick that. And I'm like, this is the most current, and maybe it would be really, really interesting. Still, the documentary, it's called Culture of Memory. That I think is the best. Actually, I don't think it was a particular ratings hit, but it's a good, interesting, nuanced hit, a nuanced look at what Germany did after the Second World War, because they weren't celebrating heroes of that conflict. Yeah, without going into it, it is a fascinating topic. So, yeah, they come from all sorts of places, and I would go to History Hit with different things. Usually, is something current, or is there something missing from their schedule? But they were really, at first, because I was an outsider, and they were like, "We'll just pay you a bit of money to go and make something yourself." But until they started becoming rating success, I was given a lot of freedom to do topics that I wanted to do, and I usually would say, "Okay, that one was on statues in Germany. I'd quite like to do ancient Egypt next because it's completely different." So yeah, for me, it was variety.
And I like the way that you sort of come at history from a different angle to what we're usually taught. I mean, Australia, for example, we get Captain Cook and Botany Bay, but you've gone and done the indigenous history of the genuine indigenous people of Australia, and it's a story. We know there are Aboriginal people in Australia. We were taught it as children. That's it. That's basically apparently the British civilized them, inverted commas. But that's all we got told as children in school. You've done this whole documentary about this tens of thousands years worth of culture that's been almost been overwritten.
Yeah, that one I am particularly proud of. I think it's very dense. I would love now to do something that was similar but had more had more location work. I directed that remotely, working with people locally. They're all indigenous interviewees. And I originally didn't want to direct that one, and I still think that it would have been good for somebody who's not a white middle class man from Britain to direct it. And I did reach out to several indigenous filmmakers, but we're on a small budget and we didn't have a lot of time. But I would prefer to step back to a producer sort of thing, but in future. But that is something that should happen. I don't think people realize that that documentary, it sounds dull as dishwater, like, oh, thousands of years of indigenous history. It is fascinating. It will bust so many myths. This idea, there's this idea of being uh people being nomadic. Some were, some weren't, that they were very simple. No, there's a lot of stuff that was they cultivated land, and they grew crops and things, and this is a bit of history that is often dismissed. And there was an indigenous historian who went and spoke to lecturers about this, and they, well, give you, but yeah, well, we've got no evidence of that. And then he said, well, there are, and it was actually written down by the white settlers who came here. They said that they saw these things, but we've just forgotten them or erased them. But the also, as you get further on into that story, you also dealing with things like eugenics, the way people tried to breed the color out of people, so they kept marrying them off until each generation they would become more and more white. And there were things like indigenous knowledge very often intersects with environmentalism, because you were closer to the land. So that came up. So every Indigenous person I spoke to was passionate to talk about the environment. These are things, it shouldn't come from me, but if I, have choice to produce these things, and it should be producing rather than directing in future. Um, that I, yeah, there's such important stories, but the Indigenous history of Australia was something that you just won't believe how exciting and incredible and really emotive that documentary is. It still makes me upset that it is not talked about and talked about on their own terms through their own history. It's an incredibly long history and it intersects with the world, including, not just Europe. Long before there's so much to that history. It needs to be covered more.
That's absolutely fascinating, Mark. And it is a story that absolutely needs to be told and more people need to be aware of.
Um, you said it's a very important story to be told. I think one thing to add to that is that it is many stories. Sounds like a very sort of typical wanky thing to say, oh, it is not one story, it's many stories. But it's the whole idea of doing, something on the Indigenous history of Australia is, of course, ridiculous because it's an incredibly long amount of time. But quite early on, when I was speaking to people, they said, well, it's almost it's almost silly to try and consider it as one history because this is a history of an entire continent with lots of different, essentially it's like trying to do the history of all of Europe and considering it a single country. So in terms of time and geography, it is many different stories. It's um it can be difficult to clump people together, so I wanted to do it as a sort of a good jumping off point to learn more about it. But it is a history that we shouldn't condense as much, and including the title of the whole documentary, I think is condensing that. But I did include, even in the intro of the film, an acknowledgement of that.
About this time last year, I got a little bit obsessed with the film Picnic at Hanging Rock, and it just watching that just made me think that really sort of white European people don't belong in Australia. It's completely alien environment, and the indigenous people, the land and the the wildlife and the environment seems to be just part of who they are in a way that that people who come from the West and settle there, they can never be connected to the land in the way that the indigenous people are connected to the land.
Yeah, I mean, people change and people, because I always try and think about people adapt or don't adapt in different ways, and you have to be, I guess, kind of open to that sort of change. But I think I spent 6 months living and traveling around Australia, and I almost nobody I met, most people I met said that either they were born in the UK or one of their parents, one or both of their parents were. And when people say to me like, "Oh, well, it must, I don't want to go to Australia. It sounds scary. It's full of all these terrible bugs." It's like, well, most people live in quite nice, houses away from a lot of that danger. Not completely, but it's yeah, you can see a lot of just it just there's a lot of things that you can see this the Australian people can be a sort of mix of the Brits and the Americans. There's sort of a lot of cultural stuff that is American, but a lot of people are very much sort of British living somewhere like that. So it's yeah, they're not connected to the landscape. They talk about their history like it's a few hundred years old. Which it is if that's where you've come from originally, and but it's not like the the white European population there is a tiny diaspora. It's quite different.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very, very much for sharing that with us, Mark. I'm going to sort of change tack ever so slightly now and go on to your short films. Now, I was
Mm.
researching this earlier on, and I'm going to read out the plot of one of your short films called The Watchers. So it says, from award-winning writer and director Mark Bowsher, The Watchers is the story of a homeless man who volunteers to take part in 4 days of medical experiments in order to get free accommodation for the rest of his life. Each night he takes a different pill, but the effects are not quite what he had anticipated. You know, that sounds like it was made with me specifically in mind. It just sounds like the sort of thing that if that came up in the local cinema or on Film 4 or something, I'd be like, right, press record. I'm watching that. I'll probably get the 4K disc when it comes out. But that sounds absolutely fascinating. It's going to sound a boring question to ask a writer, but where did the idea from that come from?
Oh, God knows. I've got no idea. I think I also wrote it quite a while ago, but I think part of it is that I always wanted to do a film that tries different styles or different it just uses different cameras so it would have a different feel. So the idea was that each pill he takes um that he gets less and less intelligent. So I wanted to sort of interpret that through first it's shot on a I think it was a Canon 5D, which was the sort of main camera, and then the first pill, yeah, is on that, and then the next pill we shot on just an old-fashioned camcorder, so the quality is less, and I'd hope that the audience would clock that it was slightly less. And then the third one is stills. It's sound over stills. I showed it at a festival in LA where it won an award, and I could just see the projectionist like because he's playing it digitally. Like I saw the mouse moving because he thought it had frozen. Um, but yeah, so that's with stills, and then the final one, it's just completely silent and it's music. And we shot it originally on 8mm, but it didn't come out on Super 8. Um, and so we ended up reshooting it on the 5D, but I sort of put some soft focus kind of effects on it to sort of make it feel dreamy and distant. So basically the idea was I was trying to find an excuse to do something where you do things with different cameras, the way it's cut and the way it's edited. Um, that was all trying to be slightly experimental. It's that very, very low key kind of like I don't show it very often because it is so cheaply done now. Even at the time, I was like, I know because we're doing this on a budget of zero that it will look slightly studenty, and at the same time, it's probably the short I'm most pleased with.
And where can we watch it? Is it on any platforms that we can see it on?
Yeah, it's on Vimeo. If you look up, Mark Bowsher, The Watchers, or The Watchers 2012, which is when it came out. Yeah, you can watch it on there.
And the other one I've seen that looks again another really interesting one is one called Only One Person Will Like This Film. And the summary says a filmmaker takes revenge on a festival that has rejected her year after year, but her revenge will not be bitter, cruel, or violent. Instead, she will use emotional manipulation to prove a point. I mean, that sounds quite frightening. Uh, um, what was the genesis of that one?
I think I showed another short film at Kino London, which was a regular short film night, and they had certain rules. If your film was over, it was an open mic film night, but your films could only be 6 minutes. If your film was over 6 minutes or didn't have the Kino logo on the end, then you had to pick a challenge film out of a bucket and the I picked one that said almost exactly the first line of that description you read, except it said he instead of she. But I I think I put two ads out there, and I had many more applications for the the female part, and it was this often happens that people assume a character is male or something like that, and I knew a lot of female film directors, and it was like, well, it would be good to see a character like that. But it's all kind of influences on that film because I want to do it's a 9 minute film, but it's silent. There are some sound effects, but it's mainly a score by Nisha Chand, who's my long-term collaborator. Again, it's very cheap. Did this for absolutely nothing. Bad quality camera. Lots of the stuff about it technically is very cheap. But I'm glad that when it was at London Short Film Festival, it was picked by the BFI as one of their 10 to try. And the picture on the article was from my film, and I think people assume that I go when I do revenge, it would be all blood and guts and stuff. And I thought there was much more interesting things you could do. So she submits a film every year, and we see this sort of in a montage with music and stuff. And then she keeps getting rejected from her weird animations that she makes. And in the end, she gets some really brutal feedback saying that, to be honest, the reason that we have not selected your film is that there is only one person who will enjoy your film, and you've already seen it. And she gets very angry, but the guy has accidentally left his name on the email. So she researches him. She looks up, she finds out stuff about his life, and she makes a film that is absolutely pandered to him, and it really touches him. And it just the film ends just before the end and says, if you want to program this film, um, if you want to see what happens next, you'll have to program this film. So she sort of blackmails him, and then it sort of leads to her sort of revenge, and it's more psychological, and it's kind of a sweet sort of film in a lot of ways. And I do really like it, even though, since I've done that just before I went freelance, I think most of my work, my documentaries and stuff are much higher quality, you know, and I would love to sort of go back and make some more films on a high quality, which is why I, end up doing Ships in the Day recently.
And as a director, who do you cite as a big influence in your style? Or are you your own man with your own style?
Um, there are so many things. You know, it's obviously nice to think that you're your own person with your own style, but you're influenced by everything you ever watched, even stuff that you don't like. And it's difficult because I find myself sort of leaning on very typical kind of um, you know, Scorsese and Spielberg and people like that. But I like Carol Reed as well. What else do I like? There are so many filmmakers, and sometimes it's just watching, you know, documentaries like Mark Cousins' Story of Film and seeing all these different ideas and techniques and things, and that influences you as well. And I love this idea of doing stuff that is silent. I like the idea of doing films that, um, express themselves silently. There's a feature I really want to do called The Assassin's Ball, which features an insane dance scene where people are getting killed off one by one, but there's no dialogue during it. And I love writing dialogue, but I love that sort of balance when there's nothing. But yeah, the point is, it's everything. Everything is an influence.
And you touched on your new project called Ships in the Day. Is there anything at all you can share with our listeners about that?
Yeah, I mean it's going to film festivals, so I don't have to be too secretive about it. It is um essentially it was a challenge that Jake Martin, my regular DOP, set me. It was like, we should not film anything that's, narrative for ages. We need to get back to sending things to festivals, but we only had a day and no budget last year to do it. So we managed to get two actors, and we filmed it in a field. But essentially, the setting is post-apocalyptic. Don't expect too high budget kind of stuff, although you see some stuff in flashback. It was all a challenge of how much we could do on a summer's day in Bristol and surrounds. And it's about two strangers who meet on this plane, and they might be the last two human beings alive. Um, and they have communicated and have clearly believed themselves to be father and daughter. As soon as they turn up, it's evident that that's not who they are. But they have clearly, through just loneliness and madness, convinced themselves that that's who they are. So, will they sort of carry on and say the things to each other that they wanted to say, that they never got to say to each other, even though they are not related? But it's sort of about how all human beings can have this sort of commonality and stuff like that, and how we can intersect, and how also we sometimes just choose not to. So yeah, I wish I had done a film that was a bit more kind of had like The Watchers. It's full of different sequences and techniques. This is quite it's quite a simple conversation piece. It's 6 minutes long. So it's very simple, and I don't know how that's going to fare in festivals, but emotionally, in terms of the script, I'm very pleased with it. But I would love to do something that's maybe a bit more dynamic next time. But yeah, we're very lucky to I put a casting up for it and managed to. I was approached by an actor, Natasha Patel, who was very keen to do the project, who's just been in the Luther movie and is in a series called Red Eye at the moment, has a small part in that. And she was really fantastic to work with, and I have this feeling that she's going to do very well for herself. So yeah, I'm excited to see it, and I am really hoping that either her or Chris Lines, who plays the father character in it, might. It would be wonderful if it goes to a festival and one of them gets nominated for an acting award or something like that. But at the moment, my eyes are set on just getting it to festivals.
And when it's done the festival circuit, will that be available to view anywhere?
And obviously, it'll be available at the festivals, and then probably once the festival circuit is over, it will go up online. But I think that will probably be, at least a year from now. But yeah, I will be posting lots of stuff on festivals and where people can go and see it. I'll be focusing on UK festivals, for sure.
That's absolutely fantastic, Mark. Thank you very, very much indeed. And thank you very much for listening to me and answering the questions. I'm going to hand back over to Ash now to wrap up.
Well, first of all, I'm going to check out all of these shorts. I should have said, obviously, that I watched them all before, but I'm being honest. So I'm going to check out all of these, and they sound fascinating. Ed, they're just right up Ed Street. I don't want to call him some weird Ed film, but he seems to have coined that phrase.
It's a compliment.
It's a compliment.
Sounds good.
It means that they're not like mine, which are really straightforward. Like one film that we reviewed recently, most people call it the talk in this group. Yeah. Have you ever seen the film The Rock, Mark?
Yeah, no, I like the film The Rock. It's good fun.
Yeah. Well,
Ed's not a fan.
You're quite right. It's a good film. It's a lot of fun.
It's a 3-star action film. Just to sort of sit right on the fence to not make anyone upset. It's fun.
I'm taking that's 3 out of 5, not 3 out of 10, as how Ed would usually rate it, or less. Well, on that bombshell, that's a rating for Mark, the man who knows his stuff. So on that bombshell, I'm signing off. It's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
And it's a goodbye from me.